right. Well, good evening. Yeah. Welcome to God's Design for Wholeness, Developmental Psychology, and Our Christian Formation. That's sort of like the flight attendant's announcement of, welcome to this flight that's going to Memphis. If you didn't mean to be going to Memphis, we're sorry. Yeah. So Nate and I are excited about this 4-week adventure that we're going to have together. We thought we'd start with introductions for those of you that don't know one or either of us. I always like to have something in my, about the people that are doing the teaching. So I'm Jim Hobby, for those of you that don't know me. I've been a follower of Jesus since 1970. I was 13 years old when I accepted Christ. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, 11 delightful grandchildren, 10 of whom are still with us here on earth. I've been ordained since 1986, served lots of different places, sizes of congregations, most recently as the Bishop of Pittsburgh. I've been interested in this idea of developmental discipleship for decades, literally. I was a Christian education major at Wheaton College, and so we were introduced to childhood development, kind of youth ministry, et cetera, et cetera. And 22 years ago, I met with a group of folks at St. Peter's, and we talked about a model for developmental discipleship. I have reams of notes from our meetings. So this is something that's been near to my heart for decades, and it's really fun to see it kind of emerging and coming out. I'm passionate about this topic because I believe that understanding the process of human development and how it intersects with catechesis and Christian formation will make us better at becoming fruitful, thriving disciples of Jesus, and will help us to encourage others to be more effective in their journeys as disciples as well. So I'm excited to be here.
Yes, and I'm Nate Webster, Jennifer Webster's husband, father of little Isla Rose, the Shirley Temple child you see running around everywhere. Like Bishop Jim, I've had a chance to really have a lot of hands-on experience with development. I've been doing clinical mental health counseling for about 10 years, and I teach as an adjunct professor of psychology at Valencia College in Orlando. Anybody familiar with that little college down there? And developmental psychology is something that I get the opportunity to see kind of hands-on every day. Right now in my career, I work with a lot of veteran couples and families. And so, military service can have a lot of impact on a person's development. And so I get a chance to kind of see that on the front line every day. And I'm just excited to be here to kind of bring what I have taught in the classroom on different occasions and get to kind of help people with in the counseling room to you guys. And I hope it's going to be a really good time bridging this really interesting gap between our Christian formation and developmental psychology and, of course, God's design for wholeness. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bishop Jim to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you. So we've introduced ourselves, and I want to introduce the course. So basic ideas, introducing the course. People grow and develop throughout the course of their lives. I know, shocker, for this I came out on a cold evening to find out that people grow and change through their life, right? But it's interesting to me how that's such an obvious truth, and yet it's an obvious truth that we don't really actually take into account very often. In fact, a lot of the literature, the stages kind of start 65 and older, as if there's no development between 65 and 98, right? You're just old, right? As a 66-year-old, I've graduated to being old, but so we change. And this development, we believe, is God's design. There's one way of reading the story in Genesis 1 through 3, of Adam and Eve actually developing, that God gives them this test, if you will, in the garden, and it's kind of like, so which are you going to choose? Are you going to choose, intimacy and closeness with me, or are you going to choose, autonomy for yourself, and what does this look like? And but it's God's design that we grow and develop. And what we want to do is we want to align the Christian formation with this development to make it more fruitful. So this is intuitively obvious, right? Like if you take 2-year-olds and you say to them, okay, open your Bible to Romans 14, and starting at verse 7, Julie, would you read? We know that 2-year-olds can't read, and we know that that's not going to be an effective way to disciple 2-year-olds. So intuitively we have this sense, but it's interesting to me how often in the church we sort of go to this default of conceptual discipleship that's all about big ideas, even though early on in our development, we have no capacity for big ideas. And so we're going to make the case for being able to kind of pull together our human development with our Christian formation and wanting to link those so that what we're doing in Christian formation fits what's happening in our human development. All right, make sense? All right, now, because of sin, none of us develops perfectly or fully at every stage. We have holes in our souls. Again, intuitively obvious, and yet we don't really take that into account. So for example, what happens if the hole in your soul is created, in your infancy and early childhood? And it's like, oh, no problem. You come to faith when you're 27, and we just explained to you that God the Father loves you unconditionally. It's like, well, yes, thank you. But my experience of fathers is that they don't love unconditionally. In fact, that they're angry alcoholics who beat the crap out of you at the least provocation. Oh, well, that's not God. Well, thank you. I'm healed, right? You can't mend a hole just with an idea. And so we're gonna kind of help put that together and say, if the holes get created when we're infants, they're going to be healed in a different way than just simply having it explained to us. All right? Purpose of the class, 4 purposes, 3.5 purposes. First is explaining. We're going to take some time and just work out what this means. We're going to look at these observable patterns. Nate's going to unpack the developmental psychology side of this. These observable patterns within our culture particularly, but patterns that actually go beyond cultures. We'll be using these insights, particularly of a keen observer by the name of Erik Erikson, regarding stages of development, kind of as the skeleton for our conversation. All right? So explaining. The second one is personalizing. We're going to kind of look at what this is and identifying holes in our own souls, are places that we didn't get really formed as followers of Jesus, or as humans, really. And so identifying places that might need further reflection, conversation, therapy, healing, prayer, whatever it is that the Lord would call us to kind of address those holes. The third thing we're going to do is helping. Hopefully what this course will do is give you some tools to figure out how you might help people in your life, not just yourself, but help people in your life to take their next steps in development. And a point I would want to make over and over again is that this development doesn't stop. So there's not a point at which you kind of go, okay, well, I'm 47. That's it, right? I am fully developed. That's not how this journey works. And so by explaining how this whole process works, how development happens, how the holes in our souls work, hopefully you can look at your own life, but you can also look at the lives of people around you, either younger than you, that you might be discipling, or older than you, that you might be helping them with their next steps. And then the fourth thing is healing. We're not going to be addressing healing. We're not going to be offering healing prayer. We're not going to be doing healing, but things that we do over the course of these next 4 weeks may actually raise issues in your heart and mind and soul and imagination that you will want to address. You may want to address it in therapy. You might want to address it in healing prayer, counsel with a close friend, whatever it is. But you may need to actively, intentionally seek healing for things in your life. Does that make sense? All right, so that's the purpose of the class. The flow of the class. We're hoping this class feels more like a seminar than it does a lecture course. So So we're going to be giving input, but then giving you a chance to really respond to it. So we'll give you some input about the developmental stages, implications, but we're also then going to offer an experience of what Christian formation would look like at that stage. And so tonight we're going to be looking at infants and toddlers. So we're going to be having you look carefully at all of Romans 3, because that's what infants and toddlers do. So, and then you're going to have small group reflection time, and then you'll come back with your own insights and questions, and we'll have a time to kind of debrief a little bit at the end. So that'll be kind of the general flow of how we'll do it. And just to let you know, forewarning, Nate and I will be taking copious notes of all your insights, so that when we write our book, it'll be much better because of what you've offered. But you won't get any credit for it. So, like every good author. That's right. All right. Back to you, Nate.
Thank you, Bishop Jim. And so now we're going to get into the main kind of content and meat and potatoes of tonight's lesson. I'll be covering 3 or 4 main sections with you now. We'll be starting first with what is developmental psychology, then getting into the history of developmental psychology, and then lastly, how do we bridge Christian formation in developmental psychology. So let's jump in with what the heck is developmental psychology. So to put a massive field of research into a very simple definition, developmental psychology is the study of how human thinking and behaving develops across a lifespan. So as Bishop Jim was mentioning, from birth to death, and the best practices for creating and sustaining healthy thinking and behaving across a lifespan. To put it in even simpler terms, developmental psychology is basically studying how to do being human well, how to basically live well, think well, behave well. And believe it or not, hundreds of scholars over hundreds of years have spent a lot of time chewing on this question, because life is a very interesting thing to study, and the question of how to do it well is oftentimes on a lot of our minds. Which means that developmental psychology touches a lot of things. Sometimes it touches so much, you can think to yourself, my goodness, what does developmental psychology not talk about? And that means you get everything from parenting in childhood. That's something that developmental psychology spends a lot of time on. Morality and identity. Believe it or not, each and every one of us, once upon a time, had to develop a sense of morality. And how do you even develop that sense of morality? Meaning and purpose. A big part of life is not just getting 3 square meals a day and a roof over your head, but some of those, what we call existential needs and existential feelings, like meaning and purpose. Obviously, family and relationships as an extension of parenting and childhood is a big part of developmental psychology. And then, of course, life is not just raising kids and having a job. It's also how you end well, right? How you end well. And so aging and generativity is a big part of what developmental psychology studies also. Of course, you need to take a moment to kind of ask yourself, well, what is the difference between developmental psychology, which is kind of this niche part of psychology as a whole? And so I kind of like to think of it in these very simple terms. Development is basically the how. How do we develop a psychology? Do we just kind of wake up one day and have opinions and beliefs and proclivities and inclinations? No, there's a whole process and mechanism in which it plays into how we kind of develop that, and that's development, the how, which then creates psychology, which is the what. What is your psychology? And so in that way, we see this little definition, how things work, development, and what is the thing that is working? Psychology. So now let's get into the history of developmental psychology. I'm going to try my best to summarize 200 years of psychological history. One of the really cool things to take a step back and be aware of and to almost kind of understand as we kind of get into this subject is that humans have been reflecting and thinking about development for a really, really long time. It's not something that in the 20th and 21st century, we just started writing books about because it was interesting. People have been reflecting on how to live life well since Aristotle and Plato were debating, as we see in the famous painting before us. And some of these quotes I just love to kind of read because it transports me back to people several thousand years ago who were thinking to themselves, what does it mean to live well? With Plato saying, don't force your children into your ways, for they were created for a time different from your own. To Marcus Aurelius, the art of living is more like wrestling than dancing. But the birth of modern Western psychology is something that is a bit unique to the last 200 years. And there's a few different qualifying words in that sentence that I just want to point out. It's modern, right? And it's Western. So there's lots of people who have thought about psychology, what makes us tick. Hippocrates' four humors, right? He thought we had liquids inside of us that impacted our mood, but as far as modern understanding of psychology is concerned, and the Western world, which would be Europe and the Americas, our history is about 200 years old. And a really interesting thing to know about psychology is, where did it come from? What basically kicked it all off? And what kicked it all off, interestingly enough, was a bunch of scholars in the 1800s that bridged two pretty unrelated fields into one, and that was philosophy and physiology. Philosophy and physiology. And a lot of people for a long time wondered if our brain structures impacted our behavior. Are there things going on in our mind? Are there mechanisms going on in our body that impact our emotions, the way we think, the way we feel? And when those two fields of research were bridged together, it created the field of psychology as we know it today. And to put it in very simple terms, the field of modern Western psychology has basically had four waves. We're in, obviously, the fourth wave, the present one, with individuals like Brené Brown and Henry Cloud. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with some of those known modern psychological thinkers, but started way back in the beginning with a couple of gentlemen named William James and Wilhelm Wundt, when they were doing basically the most elementary psychological experiments you can think of. Wilhelm Wundt did an experiment where he played a buzzing sound and monitored how quickly it would take his participant to press a button. Pretty revolutionary for psychology 100 years, 200 years ago. With wave two being, of course, individuals like Sigmund Freud, who gave us all kinds of very bizarre perspectives on human psychology, but also some very interesting ones, like, hey, what if our childhood impacts our psychology? What a novel idea. That was not something people believed for a very, very long time. So Mr. Freud is someone we have to thank for that. There's, of course, Mary Calkins, the first woman to ever finish all the doctoral requirements for a PhD in psychology at Harvard, only to be denied the degree because she was a woman. So a very interesting story to read about Mary Calkins. And then, of course, in wave three, we see people like B.F. Skinner, and the gentleman that we will be focusing on for the time in our class, Mr. Erik Erikson. He was part of that third wave of psychology in the 20th century. And then, of course, the present with people like Henry Cloud and Brené Brown. Now, in the 19th and 20th century, wave 2 and 3 of the modern Western psychology movement invented things called the grand theories. The grand theories. And the grand theories, which I could spend a whole other class talking to you about, were basically the 5 ways that the psychological community understood how humans think and conceptualized how humans behaved. They were called the psychodynamic approach, the behavioral approach, the humanistic approach, the cognitive approach, and the biological approach. And all these approaches might sound familiar to some of you. Humanism today we might know as positive psychology or New Age psychology, right? And things like behavioral approach, if anyone's a teacher in here, Whether you realize it or not, the behavioral approach, B.F. Skinner's work, impacts a lot of how we get kids to remember things, because that's called classical conditioning. And of course, things like the biological approach, which Mr. Charles Darwin gave us a lot of interesting ideas about. For instance, maybe your genetics determine your behavior. Who knows, right? So these are the grand theories. And from these grand theories, most, if not all, psychological theories today can be traced back to them. Now, why is this important? Well, it was from these grand theories that the individual we'll be studying in this class devised his theory and his understanding of human psychology, specifically around development, formulated his theory of the stages of psychosocial development. Drawing primarily from Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic theory. If you didn't know that, Sigmund Freud is responsible for inventing the psychodynamic understanding of human psychology. But to Erik Erikson's credit, he pulled from a lot of other grand theories as well, which is why he is generally regarded as a really helpful and safe psychologist to study, because you're not just getting somebody who you're looking through a keyhole. You're getting somebody who really spent his time with his wife, which brownie points for him. His wife, Joan Erikson, was his editor when he first published his book. I think it was called School and Children in the 1950s. It was a collection of essays, which eventually turned into his stages of psychosocial development. And so you get a really great kind of scope of these different theories through Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, which, as we'll go through this class, you'll get a chance to really see and experience and kind of taste for yourself. Now, that being said, not to kind of downplay what all of the psychological sciences have kind of done for us, but more to kind of set us up for the Christian formation part of our time together in this class. It is important to realize that as much as developmental psychology is a science, at its core, it is really just the process of observing human behavior, granted in a very professional way, and then using research to interpret what those results mean. So I'll give you a couple of classic examples, and of course I want to give the caveat that correlation is not causation. We all remember sixth grade biology. But as you see here, there's a couple of really interesting observations that a developmental psychologist would make and probably research in order to reach some kind of conclusion about it. And one of those is the percentage of young men who have graduated from college tends to be higher when there's a father present in their life. Well, isn't that an interesting correlation, that a father's presence equates to graduation rates? More interestingly, and this is one you can read a lot of interesting speculation about, the correlation between teenage suicide rates and the release of smartphones in 2007, which you can see here on this chart, has been a really unfortunate reality in our modern time that a lot of developmental psychologists and educators are wrestling with as they think through what is happening in the developmental process of a young person when they're growing up with these hyper-connected smart devices. So it's these kinds of things that developmental psychologists are observing, but it's important to kind of note that it's really just that at its core. It's really good observing of what's going on and using research to interpret what that means. And that sets us up for the next portion of our lecture, which is developmental psychology and Christian formation. So how do we kind of bridge these two? This is a really good question to ask because, quite frankly, sometimes Christianity and the sciences don't always get along, and there can be a lot of suspicion between the two. And so it's good to take a pause and actually kind of process, well, how do we bridge this gap? Because developmental psychology is out here making a lot of proclamations, and do we really need to listen to them? Do we really need to step into what the science is telling us? And how do we kind of bridge that with our Christian formation, our development as believers? And the simple answer is Well, the Bible's full of developmental psychology. The Bible's full of developmental psychology. And this might be surprising to you, so I thought I'd just pull out a couple of interesting verses here. These are a couple of my favorite. Ephesians 6:4, some really great parenting advice. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And then, of course, the classic one from Ecclesiastes, young people, enjoy your youth. Be happy while you are still young. Do what you want to do and follow your heart's desire. But remember that God is going to judge you for whatever you do. Don't let anything worry you or cause you pain. You aren't going to be young very long. Really interesting, rich stuff that you would read right out of a modern developmental psychology textbook right there in the Bible we read. And so because of that, it very simply answers this question of how do we bridge the two with this very simple answer. As Christians, we believe that science isn't just inventing or discovering, okay, but also observing and recording God's intelligent design. Science is going out there, and as they are discovering and as they are inventing, as believers, we believe it's not just that, it's actually also observing and recording God's intelligent design. Because God created our world with an intelligent design. You can think of it a bit like a blueprint, that's helpful. You know, plants need what? Sun and water. Well, children need love and nurturing, right? And with that, this means that Christians can draw upon the observations and discoveries that science makes to better understand God's intelligent design and our own Christian formation. So, with all that being said, we're now going to get into our first two stages of Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. And to kind of give you a visual representation of what those ages are, we have our cartoon baby and our cartoon toddler, stage 1 and 2. But let's do maybe a brief snapshot of what Erik Erikson's theory is really all about from a high-level perspective, and then we'll get a bit more granular. So Erik Erikson conceptualized that throughout each and every one of your lives, my life included, we go through 8 stages of development. And each of these stages are fraught with all kinds of interesting needs that we have, but also all kinds of interesting barriers and hurdles we need to work through. And he conceptualized this in 8 stages, each with a competition between 2 outcomes. 8 stages, each with a competition between 2 outcomes. And you can see these competitions, you can see this competition in the blue above each stage, where we see words like trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and guilt, initiative versus guilt. And it was Erik Erikson's conceptualization of development that when we're going through this stage, the experiences we have and the things we go through determine the winner of the stage and the outcome that results in thereof. And obviously, to put it very simply, the goal is to successfully get through each stage. That's the hope, that's the goal, and that's the desire. So this is it from a high-level perspective. And tonight we're going to get into infancy and early childhood, trust versus mistrust, and autonomy versus shame and doubt. So to kick us off, we're going to, because I'm the teacher, watch a 40-second video of Isla when she was first born. She was no more than, I want to say a day old. Yeah, this is her when she's less than a day old. So she came out big and with a full head of hair. And this is it, folks. I mean, for anybody who has kids and it's been a while since you held a baby, or don't have kids yet, I mean, that is what we're basically like when it all kicks off. Just little piles of adorable mush, absolutely helpless and absolutely just gravitating to the most beautiful and basic of needs, which, as Erik Erikson outlines, is can I trust the world? Can I trust the world? Is the world a trustworthy place, or is the world a bit of an untrustworthy and scary place? And this might sound a bit strange because infants are pre-verbal, right? None of us really remember what's happened in the first 2 years of our life. And yet, profoundly, and with a lot of research to back it up, all those things we don't remember and all those experiences we can't recall play a massive, massive role in our perception of trusting basically whether or not the world is going to meet our needs and our attachment to the people around us. And it's for this reason that Erik Erikson conceptualized that what we need most in the early days and in the first year of life are these meeting of needs. Is this dependability of a caregiver? Is this affection from our caregiver? Receptiveness from a caregiver? Consistency and emotional availability. All these things can kind of sound a bit straightforward, but to kind of deepen our understanding of this stage, I kind of want to give you what I like to call a concept metaphor. And so I want you to kind of take a moment to imagine that newborn children are a bit like different kinds of seeds, each unique from one another, each needing kind of slightly different things, but all needing water and sunshine, which is provision and nurturing. Each and every one of us need that provision and nurturing, but each and every one of us need it slightly different because we all have slightly different personalities. But it's that relationship with water and sunshine, provision and nurturing in that first year of life that can go on to dictate, as I say here, a young child and eventually a person's sense of hope and trust about water and sunshine for years to come. So think of it another way. What happens when the sunshine is inconsistent, right? What happens when you only get just enough water to get by? How does that impact the seed's ability to blossom and start their life well? And it's for this reason, and it's for these reasons that individuals like Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlsby, at the same time that Erik Erikson was alive, invented something called attachment theory. And attachment theory is pretty popular these days, so you may have heard of it before. They were contemporaries of Erik Erikson, and they at times worked together, and Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlsby pulled a lot of stuff from Erik Erikson and found that, again, this is always mind-blowing to me, that in your first year of life, you're developing an attachment theory for how you're going to connect with people for the rest of your life. And they conceptualized that there's 4 ways that you can attach to people, in a very secure way, in a very avoidant way, in a very ambivalent way, in a very disorganized way. And as Bishop Jim mentioned, we're not going to start getting into all our baggage here tonight, but this is a really good takeaway for you, and I recommend this book, Attached, The New Science of Adult Attachment, and how it can help you find and keep love, that really can give you a chance to reflect on this question. What's my attachment style? Attachment styles are things we bring into all kinds of situations. Making new friends, raising our kids, our relationship with God. It's all par for the course when it comes to your attachment style. And it all starts at that very formative age because we're all little seeds needing water and sunshine. We're all just kind of starting off. And then, of course, there's stage 2, the second stage. And stage 2, which is ages 1 to 2, just like stage 1, has this competition between 2 outcomes and has this question we're asking ourselves at this age, which again is kind of a pre-verbal question. The question is more for our adult minds to conceptualize what's happening on kind of a metaphysical level for these children. But the question we're asking ourselves is it okay to be me? Is it okay to be me? And the competition is between autonomy and shame and doubt. And when we're 1 and 2 years old, some really amazing things are starting to happen. And what's happening between 1 and 2 is we're becoming mobile. We're becoming mobile, which is a very simple and slightly annoying thing for us as grown-ups, but a very profound thing for the little guy or little girl who's doing it, like my godson Elijah back there. And so, with that, you have this very important season in a child's life where the freedom to explore has a profound impact on this question of, is it okay to be me? I always get a little heartbroken when I see parents who are always slapping the wrist of an 18-month-old, because what they're developing is this sense of freedom to explore and this sense of peace and acceptance about their curiosity, about these newfound things called hands that allow them to grab stuff, and these newfound things called legs that can move them without mommy and daddy having to kind of move them.
Did we all here in this room go through these stages?
Yes, if you're a human and you're breathing and you're alive tonight, you went through these stages.
Identically like robots, or?
Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, it would be nice. I think if we all did, we'd all be perfect. But
Yeah.
we aren't perfect. I mean, even from the get-go, we're all sinners. But some are criminals, and some are, don't accomplish anything, and some have suicidal tendencies. They run the gamut of what people are. Not what they, by the psychology, psychosocial stage format, do.
Yeah, so that's...
This is a textbook.
Yeah, so that's a great comment. So do we kind of go through all these robotically, and what kind of happens when we don't? Well, one of the interesting debates in psychology right now, especially with the mapping of the genome, I don't know how much you guys follow that stuff, is this whole debate around nature versus nurture. Nature versus nurture. Nature being how you were born, and nurture being how the people raised you and the way that impacted the way you turned out. And Erik Erikson takes all that into consideration with his approach and conceptualization of the stages of life that we kind of go through. You can think of the nature as the things that we need. So these kind of answers I'm outlining for you are those things that are hardwired and embedded that you kind of need. And as we kind of go through these stages, you'll see those different things that we kind of need at each stage of life. But then the nurture comes in when you start talking about how the caregivers in your life are kind of meeting them. And whether or not that means a criminal is not responsible for what he does because his mother wasn't there, that's for a philosopher to debate. But there's a lot of people who discuss that. I think there's another statistic I read around the number of incarcerated individuals who grew up without a father, and so there's so much profundity to the conversation around developmental psychology, because if we can, as a society and as believers, really dig into what helps us to live well. I mean, you're talking about changing everything from, the incarceration rate in prison system to government to education to healthcare. And Erik Erikson, of course, just did his part with these 8 stages, and obviously is outlining the ideal, right? But hopefully your imaginations can see what happens when we don't reach the ideal. And so with that, there's also at this stage of life, participation in tasks, which is extremely important. Healthy intervention, which is one I love to just take a minute to talk about, because again, as an adult and from the adult perspective, toddlers can be very frustrating and a little annoying because they're always wanting to get into stuff. But that actually is a part of a process in them that helps them develop this sense of peace and, most importantly, this sense of okayness around being themselves. And that's why for this stage, I love to use the concept metaphor of a construction worker who has stumbled upon a box full of new tools. A construction worker that has stumbled upon a box full of new tools. Moving, grabbing, pointing, talking, and crawling. These are all things that a toddler, for the first time, when they're getting those fine motor skills, are discovering and realizing they have. But guess what nurturing role we get to play at that stage of life? We get to play a profound role in teaching that toddler the relationship between those tools. Do we encourage it? Do we discourage it? Do we punish it? Do we celebrate it? And when you get down to it, the way we parent and nurture and foster that relationship between a toddler and their newfound box of tools will go on to create in that child a sense of either autonomy or shame and guilt around their urges, their will, and their intention. Now, obviously, anyone who listens to a psychology lecture for the first time or even goes into therapy for a first time can be a little overwhelmed by the, reality of what's kind of going on inside of us. I remember when I was first starting out in grad school for getting my degree in mental health counseling, my program required us to get therapy. And I remember sitting in a counselor's office, and my first reaction was, wow, there's so much wrong with me. and it scared the bejesus out of me, because not only did I feel like my therapist just uncovered this whole secret world of problems I didn't realize humans could even have, let alone I could have. But on top of that, I also felt like it was quite a tall mountain. It was quite a tall mountain. But one of the things to keep in mind as you listen to me speak this evening and as we go through this course over the next 4 weeks is that nobody, and Bishop Jim might even make a point that even God is not expecting you to figure it all out tomorrow. In fact, there's a time and place for development, and there's a time and space for development. And Erik Erikson makes that point as well. If there's a stage in your life that didn't really go the way it was supposed to, there's hope for that. God can do something about it. And if there's something in your life you want to figure out today, most likely you just got to give it some time and it'll come along. And so with that being said, and that kind of laying the groundwork and giving you a bit of a taste of what the first two stages are about, I'll turn it over to Bishop Jim.
Awesome. Thanks, Nate. One thing I want to add, when you're thinking about these stages, think of them more as like overlapping than, I used to live outside of Buffalo, and we could drive to Canada, and there was a clear border, like you would stop and they would ask questions, and you tell them how long you're going to be there and stuff. But it's like you left the United States and you entered Canada. That's not how these stages work. It's not like, some random Tuesday you stop being an infant and become a toddler, or you stop being a toddler and become, kind of early child. It's like there's this kind of overlap between these stages, and oftentimes that overlaps part is the really awkward part, because particularly for parents, is like you've just gotten used to this stage, and then all of a sudden you wake up and it's like you can do that, and which as a parent it's like that's your whole life, right? All the way through them getting married. You're like you can do that, and then having children, you can do that. And you're like, yeah. So you're always one stage behind as a parent, trying to desperately catch up. Like, oh, you can climb. I didn't know that. Let me get you off the bookcase because I don't think that's safe, right? Yeah. So here's some implications for Christian formation. First of all, trust is foundational. Now, obviously, we know that. Like there's so many passages about trust, et cetera. But here's the deal: our capacity for trust is determined in the first year of our life. So this whole thing of, the infancy, trust versus distrust, it's like your capacity for trust is sort of built there. One of my greatest pictures is of our youngest grandchild, Rosie, Angela's youngest. And she and Sherry have this really wonderfully special relationship. And Sherry will be sitting on our love seat, and Rosie will climb up into her lap and then stand kind of next to her. And then at just random moments, she'll fling herself back into Sherry's arms. Whether Sherry's looking or not, or whether Sherry has any idea this is about to happen. But for me, I've actually started that as in my own prayer life. As I'll say to the Lord, I fling myself into your arms. Because it is such a wonderful picture of trust. It's like, I have no reason to believe that the powers of the universe are going to let me fall and hurt myself. And so she just goes, boo! And so far, Sherry's been 100% in catching her. There will come a point when she will learn that her grandparents are fallible and are broken by sin and not completely reliable. But so far, she hasn't learned that. And we're going to try to keep it a secret as long as possible. But that picture of trust, of her just flinging herself back, is, I think, at the heart and core of Jesus' message. If you unpack Jesus' message about how we're going to relate to the Father, he's like, why are you worried about what you're going to wear or what you're going to eat? Your Heavenly Father knows that. And we're like, yeah, but, right? And it's the but part of how we respond to all of Jesus' calls to trust that reveal the broken place in our own heart. Because here's the deal. None of us get out alive of any of these stages, right? None of us get out of these stages fully formed, fully shaped. We graduate with honors. We all get out of these stages, with brokenness because our parents were broken. And here's the thing about trust. And talking about the attachment theory, one of the things that, as I've read about attachment theory and listened to podcasts and stuff, I've kind of seized on this thing of embracing and. It's possible to say two things at the same time that are both true. It's possible to say that my parents absolutely did the best job that they could do, that they desperately wanted to be wonderful parents. And they weren't, right? And they failed. And they didn't give me all of the things I needed. That at those moments where trust was being formed, they proved themselves not to be trustworthy. I can say both of those things at the same time. And I can say that about my own parenting. I can say, to Angela and my daughters, I did the best that I could. And I know I left holes in your souls. Both of those things can be absolutely true. And so I think that this idea that trust is foundational becomes a core part of our Christian formation. But here's the thing about trust. It's not formed through ideas, right? It's not like I can just tell you, hey, look, God will take care of you in everything. And you say, oh, okay. Now I trust him completely and fully, and I won't ever have an anxious thought about my future, right? Because God is trustworthy. So trust is foundational, and that's the key thing that we're working on even before we can remember anything, and before we have words for anything, and where everything is just completely and utterly kind of tangible and physical and right here, all right? So responding positively to biblical truth requires this attitude of trust based on early experience. And all of us have holes in our souls. Securely attached infants and toddlers live with a sense of wonder and welcome and anticipation. That if you watch Rosie, she's like, the world is here for me. My job in the world is to just explore and pull and taste and climb and do this. She's a little bit like her mom. I owe you $5 because I didn't get your permission for this, but It's like our other daughters, it's like in a space, they would kind of wander off for about 10 yards or whatever, and they'd stop and look back. Angela's attitude to the world was, I'm the kid, you're the parents, my job is to explore, your job is to keep me from falling off the cliff. Right? So there was no looking back. It was just like, okay, here's a space, let me go explore it. But this idea of welcome and wonder and anticipation, there's not a sense of, for children that are kind of develop this trust, of like creeping around and wondering and hesitation, and like for most of us, right? For most of us, the Lord says, kind of step out, and we're like, will it hold? Will it hold? It's like, I think it'll hold, let me test it, right? Rosie's not going to do that. She's just going to be like, okay, whoo, here we go. All right. Malformation at this stage affects our desires, our wills, our minds. So if we don't develop this secure trust that the universe is safe, that the powers around will take care of me, that affects kind of every single part of us. It affects how we think. It affects what we desire, that we're desiring safety, et cetera, so forth. All right. So practical application from the inside out. Personally, infants and toddlers are the recipients of care and delight, not responsible agents. So at the first 2 years, it's like, by the time you're getting to the late twos, there is some agency involved, like, don't touch that, okay. But early on, infants and early toddlers are not thinking to themselves, I am going to impose my will on the universe. And I know that Dad said, don't do this, but watch me, I'm going to do it anyway, right? That at this stage, they're not responsible agents. They're just simply doing. They're learning. They're trying all of these tools. And just because they're annoying to us as adults doesn't mean that they're doing something that's wrong. Does that make sense? So they're there to receive from us. Malformation at this stage may manifest itself in our adult lives by us giving mental assent to articles of faith, right? You do know that the creed starts with I believe, but in Greek, the word means I trust. So let that settle in for a second. That what we're actually saying Sunday by Sunday isn't, I give mental assent to the fact that God is Trinity. What we're saying is, I fling myself into the arms of a God who is Almighty and Father, and right? So if you change that in your mind Sunday by Sunday, and you say to yourself, not I believe in God the Father Almighty, but you say to yourself, I trust God the Father Almighty. Right? But what happens is if our souls are malformed and trust isn't fundamental, then what we do is we transfer that flinging ourselves into the arms of God into a mental idea about God. Does that make sense? And then we think that assenting to the mental idea is the goal. And then evangelism becomes trying to get other people to mentally assent to the ideas that you have about God, as opposed to actually putting their trust in God. All right, see how that all kind of begins to kind of flesh itself out? And then Christian formation becomes getting more and more ideas about God and getting a fuller and fuller understanding of the ideas that we have about God. And then we fill our shelves with notebooks of ideas about the Bible and about God, but we don't fill our lives with trust. A.W. Tozer said that everything that we know about God that we don't live out kills our souls. Yeah. All right. Then that can then lead to this place where we kind of work feverishly, to please God, provide for ourselves, et cetera, which we'll kind of talk about in other stages. But without that fundamental foundation of trust, think of it as a wall, that if you're building a wall, you're going to kind of add bricks as you go up. Think of trust as the footers. Like this is the concrete that gets poured that holds everything else up. And so if that has never gotten poured, and you've just simply have built the rest of your spiritual life kind of on the sand, Jesus has a parable about that. And trust is those footers, the concrete that we're building on. All right, so family. So moving from personally to family, here's what you can be doing. These are some of the applications. Model it. Yeah, so, now obviously infants aren't going to be thinking to themselves, oh, I see what Dad did there, right? But you're living it out. You're living this life of trust. You're living this life of believing that God is going to care for you. And so the earliest memories, if we're doing it right as parents, the earliest memories are going to be of mom and dad trusting. Rhythms of family prayer and Bible reading. One way to kind of live out that life of trust is to just develop these rhythms and these patterns. When our girls were little, Sherry and I would do compline every night, and we would light a candle, and then we would gather, starting with Elizabeth, and then eventually all three of them. We would just kind of gather around this little altar with a candle, and we would do our night prayers, our compline prayers. And Keep Watch, Dear Lord became like the prayer for our family. That was like, now, I don't know at what age each of the girls memorized that prayer. At one point, Elizabeth announced to Sherry that Jesus took a break at night. And Sherry's like, what? He goes, yeah, because every night we pray that the angels would take charge. So that's when Jesus, that's when Jesus takes a break. So conceptually, they didn't have all of the theology correct, but they knew the prayer. Yeah, so finding different ways. Kids are sponges when it comes to memorizing things. So praying some of the same prayers over and over, like the liturgy. It's like the Lord's Prayer becomes not just like a prayer that the adults pray, but everybody prays it. And here's the key thing. Even though they don't understand all of the words, right, it becomes embedded in their hearts. They'll grow into understanding. The biggest mistake we make, one of the biggest mistakes we make in Christian formation is thinking that the path to our wills and desires is through our head. That's not always true. In fact, oftentimes, we'll work the other way, that we'll work into understanding something by actually obeying or memorizing or learning or whatever, that eventually we'll understand it, that we don't have to understand it before we live it or obey it. If that makes sense. All right. So as the child grows, then the ritual can be more elaborate. You can add, scripture readings. You can, make it longer. You can do all kinds of things, as the kids grow and develop. But having that kind of, here's when we do this, and here's how we do it, can make a big difference. All right. Continuing out. The church. Nursery ministry needs to be seen as more than babysitting. Ministry to infants expresses God's care and delight to them. So I get it. I've served churches for a long time, and I understand getting volunteers, to do things like, do nursery ministry is really hard. Part of the reason it's hard is because we don't have a heroic cause for nursery ministry, right? If you're basically saying, look, it's really easy. All you have to do is just kind of come and sit there, and if they pee their diapers, you change them, and just kind of keep them alive until mom or dad comes and gets them for the peace and brings them up for communion or comes at the end of the service. It's like, that's not a heroic cause. Like, sure, I'll give my life to warehousing children. Now, if you say, would you be willing to give an hour of your life at the most critical stage in anybody's personal development, where you can be for an hour the face of God expressing delight and care for children who are trying desperately to figure out trust versus mistrust?
Amen. Sign me up. I will.
Right? This isn't about keeping kids alive for an hour. This is about expressing God's delight in them, about showing them that the world is a place where they can fling themselves into the care of God. right? Yeah. So nursery ministry needs to have this sense that no kid is going to remember that. None of us remember that first year of our life. So no child is going to come back to you, as a fourth grader and say, you were the most important person next to my parents in my life because every Sunday you expressed the care and delight of God. But that's an opportunity. That's a moment. So anyway, so nursery ministry needs to be seen as something a lot bigger than it is. Toddlers need opportunities to discover and do things themselves, with adults celebrating the effort and the process more than the product. Right? So, it's like, so what is that, Johnny? It's like, well, it's a sheep. Well, it doesn't look like a sheep. It doesn't have 4 legs, right? It's like, stop. It's like, look what I drew. Tell me about it. Well, it's this. And you're thinking to yourself, I have no idea how you would even think that that's that, right? And it's like, awesome. Did you enjoy doing that? Yeah. What's your favorite part about it? It's like, yeah. So interacting with kids, celebrating that, giving them things to do, that where they just get to be who they are and where they are. Toddlers are sensory learners, not conceptual. They have short attention spans. So if you're expecting a toddler to sit still for a half an hour while you do a flannel graph, explanation, of the paralytic being lowered down, through the roof, it's like, no, that's not where they're at, right? So figuring out what fits where they are, their imaginations, and how to do this. Most of it's going to be touch and delight and smiles, etc. All right, community. Infants and toddlers can provide their parents with opportunities for evangelistic conversations. Infants and toddlers have no responsibility for making disciples of the whole world, right? Their parents do. And infants and toddlers are a great way to connect. And by the way, as you're connecting and telling other people about Jesus because your toddlers are playing together, eventually your kids will see this and you're modeling for them who they're supposed to be.